Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we unpack complex ideas to give you a shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today, we're diving headfirst into one of the biggest, most intriguing mysteries in artificial intelligence. How do neural networks actually work on the inside? Imagine if we could look inside an AI's brain and actually see its thoughts, its internal gears turning. Today, we're exploring a groundbreaking new paper from Lucius Bushnack, Dan Braun, and Lee Sharkey titled Stochastic Parameter Decomposition that, well, it brings us closer than ever to that kind of sci-fi vision.
It's a genuinely captivating area because while these large neural networks, they can achieve truly jaw-dropping feats, often outperforming humans at specific complex tasks, our understanding of their internal, thinking processes is surprisingly limited.
Right.
If we could truly reverse engineer these mechanisms, it would be invaluable for predicting, controlling, even designing far safer AI. And, it could even unlock entirely new avenues of scientific knowledge.
Absolutely. And that's really our mission today, to unravel this new method, SPD, which promises to peel back the layers of a neural network and reveal its hidden logic. We'll be looking at how it tackles critical issues that plagued previous methods and what its impressive success in toy models tells us about the exciting future of AI interpretability. So let's unpack this. Before we delve right into SPD, let's maybe quickly set the stage for you. Why is it so incredibly difficult, fundamentally, to understand what a neural network is doing? And what have researchers tried so far to kind of crack open these black boxes?
Well, the core challenge is that neural networks are just fundamentally incredibly complex. They're often seen as these impenetrable black boxes, and for good reason.
Right.
Researchers are, desperate to break them down into individual, simpler mechanisms that you can actually study in isolation.
And if that's the goal, were there early attempts to sort of shine a light inside?
There were indeed, yeah. One popular early method was sparse dictionary learning, or SDL.
SDL, okay.
This approach, it tries to decompose neural network activations, but it ran into some conceptual and practical problems.
Such as?
Like not properly accounting for feature geometry, how different data features are spatially organized and interact within the network, or maybe more fundamentally, failing to decompose networks into truly functional components, the actual computational routines they perform. And that's a foundational issue, really.
Okay, so SDL had its issues, significant ones. What about attribution-based parameter decomposition, or APD? The paper mentions it as a more recent framework. Did that get us closer?
APD was definitely a conceptual step forward, yeah. It proposed decomposing networks into parameter components. Now, these are vectors in the network's parameter space itself, not just activation space.
Okay, different level.
Exactly. And the ideal was that these components should sum to the original model's parameters, be sparsely used, meaning only a few are active at a time, and be as simple as possible. Sounds promising, right?
It does sound promising on paper. So if it was such a significant step forward conceptually, why didn't it just become the definitive solution? What were its limitations when researchers actually tried to use it?
That's where the paper highlights some pretty significant practical issues. First, scalability. APD has a very high memory cost.
How high?
Well, because each parameter component is a whole vector in parameter space. Imagine trying to store every single brushstroke of a massive painting individually. It adds up incredibly quickly, especially for big networks.
Okay, memory hog. What else?
Second, hyperparameter sensitivity. It's notoriously difficult to tune. For example, it demands this top K hyperparameter.
The top K.
Yeah, it's the expected number of active components for any given input data point. But this is usually a complete unknown for real-world models. How would you know that in advance?
Yeah, you wouldn't, right?
Exactly. And finally, maybe the trickiest bit, reliance on attribution methods. APD lean heavily on attribution methods like gradient attributions to estimate causal importance.
And the problem there is?
Well, the problem is these are often pretty poor approximations of true causal importance. Sometimes they even fail basic sanity checks. So it raises an important question for you, the listener. If your measurement tool isn't reliable, how reliable can your insights possibly be?
So APD, while it was a good idea, it hit these major roadblocks. Memory, tuning headaches, and relying on these dodgy attribution methods. That's a lot of hurdles.
It really is.
How does SPD manage to jump over them, especially on that crucial problem of understanding what's truly important?
Well, what's truly fascinating here is how SPD sort of redefines the core problem itself. Instead of decomposing networks into directions and activation space or relying on those problematic attribution methods,
Hmm.
SPD decomposes each matrix in a network into a set of rank 1 subcomponents. Think of it like finding the most fundamental, simplest building blocks of each layer.
Rank 1 subcomponents, like the simplest possible matrices.
Exactly. These subcomponents can then later be clustered or grouped together into the full parameter components we're looking for.
Okay, but how does SPD figure out what's important or active? If it's not using those flaky attribution methods from APD, how does it know? Does it just guess?
No, not at all. This is where it gets really, really clever. SPD introduces a novel concept. It defines the causal importance of a subcomponent by how ablatable it is.
Ablatable. Okay, what does that mean? Like, can you just remove it without the whole network breaking? Sort of like AI surgery?
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. If a subcomponent, one of these tiny pieces, is truly unimportant for computing the output for a given input,
Yeah.
then you should be able to ablate it, modify it, maybe even remove it by some random amount.
And the network doesn't notice.
And the model's output remains completely unchanged. It's exactly like testing if a specific gear in a complex machine is actually essential right now, or if the machine still runs perfectly without it. If it doesn't matter, you can effectively get rid of it for that calculation.
So it's testing what happens if I poke this specific part of the AI brain. But isn't randomly masking parts a bit chaotic? How does that lead to precise insights instead of just noise?
Well, that's the systematic and stochastic brilliance of it. SPD actually trains a separate causal importance function. It's a small neural network itself whose job is to predict how ablatable each subcomponent is for a given input.
Ah, so it learns which parts can be poked.
Exactly. Then it uses these predictions to randomly mask or ablate the unimportant subcomponents during training. The model is essentially being trained to say, look, I know which parts don't matter for this input, and I'm going to prove it by randomly taking them out, and I still get the right answer.
And how does this random masking, this stochastic approach, actually lead to such clear answers about the important parts?
Because the model is trained specifically so that the version with these randomly masked subcomponents computes the exact same output as the original unmasked model.
Okay, faithfulness.
Right. And crucially, it also penalizes the causal importance values for being high. It actively encourages the model to find as many ablatable, unimportant subcomponents as possible. Zero them out if you can. This setup effectively checks many combinations of ablations probabilistically, rigorously testing what truly contributes to the network's function.
So the core idea is find the parts you can ditch without hurting performance, and what's left must be the essential mechanisms. They stand out like a neon sign.
Exactly right. The overall goal here is to identify parameter components that exhibit 3 key properties. 1, faithfulness. They have to sum precisely back to the original network's parameters. No information lost.
Got it.
2, minimality. As few components as possible should be used for any single forward pass for any given data point. Keep the explanation concise. And 3, simplicity. The components themselves should use as little computational machinery as possible. Favor elegance and efficiency. SPD achieves all this through a combined loss function during training. It balances faithfulness, making sure the decomposed parts still perfectly recreate the original network with stochastic reconstruction, ensuring the model works even when parts are randomly hidden, and it encourages minimality, pushing those importance values down unless absolutely necessary.
Okay, we've got a clear picture now of how SPD is designed, in theory, to tackle these problems. That sounds really elegant. But theory is one thing. How does it actually perform? Does this elegant solution stand up when you test it? Tell us about some of the most compelling results from the paper's experiments with these toy models.
Yeah, the results are actually quite impressive. They really demonstrate SPD's stability and its remarkable ability to recover the known ground truth mechanisms in these test cases, especially where APD, the previous method, significantly struggled.
Okay, like what?
Let's start with the toy model of superposition, TMS. This model is particularly interesting because it simulates how networks can kind of compress multiple features into a bottleneck layer, makes them notoriously hard to disentangle.
Right, superposition is tricky. So how did SPD do?
It successfully decomposed these models. They tested TMS52 and TMS4010 into subcomponents that perfectly corresponded to the underlying columns of the network's weight matrix. Basically, it found the exact features that were deliberately built into the model.
Wow, perfectly.
pretty much. And crucially, this was incredibly robust across different training runs. And importantly, it required far less hyperparameter tuning than APD, less fiddling needed.
And just to remind everyone listening, APD had major issues here, didn't it?
Indeed it did. APD exhibited significant shrinkage of the learned parameters. Imagine like a photo losing detail and sharpness as it's compressed too much. SPD, however, showed negligible shrinkage. Its components were a much closer geometrically faithful representation of the original model's structure. They quantified this using metrics like mean-max cosine similarity, MMCS, and mean L2 ratio, ML2R.
And what did those show?
For you, the listener, just know that both of these metrics were near 1 for SPD. That indicates near-perfect reconstruction and alignment with the true underlying structure. APD scores were much lower.
Okay, so it's clearly more robust, more accurate geometrically. What about that feature splitting problem you mentioned earlier, the one SDL had, where networks might learn redundant representations?
Right, good question. SPD demonstrates it doesn't suffer from that either, where learned features might sort of depend on the dictionary size you choose, essentially creating multiple words for the same concept.
How did they test that?
They used a TMS model with a hidden identity matrix worked into it. SPD correctly identified the specific number of components for both the main weight matrix and the separate identity matrix components. APD completely failed to do this. It just kind of mushed them together or got the numbers wrong.
So that's a big deal then.
It's a really big deal because it means SPD isn't just finding some components that add up correctly. It's consistently finding the right, meaningful ones. It's like finding the exact original ingredients in a recipe, not just a list of things that might be in there and sort of taste similar.
Okay, now here's where I thought it got really interesting. The paper mentions SPD actually corrects a previous finding about something called the toy model of compressed computation. So SPD isn't just a new method. It's revealing that our previous understanding of how some of these networks compute might have been incomplete or even wrong. It's like finding a hidden room in a house you thought you knew inside out.
Exactly. That's a perfect analogy. In this specific model, the network learns to compute more functions than it seemingly has neurons for. It's a truly compressed form of computation.
Okay.
Previous analysis using APD suggested the output matrix, WOUT, had 100 distinct components, each corresponding to a different input feature.
Right.
But SPD clearly found something different. It found that WOUT was actually a single, highly efficient rank 50 component. It was activating many elements simultaneously as one unified block.
Whoa, so one component doing the work of 100, basically.
In a sense, yes, it's a much cleaner, more efficient picture. And this finding aligns beautifully with new theoretical predictions about how such compression might work. It shows SPD's decomposition is more accurate, cleaner, and it didn't have this issue of finding spurious secondary features that APD seemed to invent.
That's pretty profound. SPD isn't just confirming things, it's refining our understanding. What about mechanisms that span multiple layers, not just single ones? That feels like an even tougher nut to crack computationally.
It absolutely is. And SPD also successfully identified mechanisms distributed across multiple layers. They tested this on toy models of cross-layer distributed representations, one with 2 MLP layers, another with 3.
And APD struggled there.
Yes, APD struggled significantly with models beyond 2 layers, largely due to that hyperparameter sensitivity we talked about. It just became too hard to tune correctly.
But SPD managed.
SPD managed. It showed that while the input components at the first layer were distinct, the output components formed a single large coherent component that actually spanned all the layers. This really demonstrates its ability to find genuinely distributed mechanisms, not just isolated ones working layer by layer.
So, okay, across the board on these tough test cases, SPD seems to be outperforming its predecessors. It's finding the known mechanisms more accurately, more robustly, even correcting previous findings. What does the paper hypothesize are the key reasons for this success? What's the secret sauce here?
Yeah, they lay out 4 main hypotheses for why SPD seems to work so much better and is more robust. First, and this seems critical, no top K hyperparameter.
Right, the guessing game.
Exactly. SPD doesn't need you to guess the expected number of active components in advance. Those trained causal importance functions, they adapt dynamically to the specific model being analyzed. It figures it out itself.
So it's not starting with a potentially wrong preconceived notion.
Okay.
What's second?
Second, better gradient flow. This is a bit technical, but basically, unlike APD, where gradients, the learning signals, only flowed through the selected top-type components, SPD allows gradients to flow through every single subcomponent, even those with zero importance predicted for a given input.
Why is that better?
Well, it's vital for error correction during training. If a component was wrongly assigned zero importance, it can still receive a gradient signal to correct that mistake later. It makes the whole training process much more stable by avoiding these abrupt discontinuities where information flow just gets cut off.
That makes a lot of sense. If you're cutting off the feedback loop to parts of the network, how can it ever truly learn what's important or correct itself? Okay, third reason.
Precisely. Third, reduce tension between losses. Remember the shrinkage issue with APD?
Yeah.
SPD avoids inducing that because it doesn't directly penalize the mathematical norms, the size, of the parameter matrices themselves to enforce simplicity. In APD, the need to be faithful to the original model and the push for simplicity were often pulling in opposite directions, creating this tension that made finding accurate solutions harder.
And SPD avoids that tension.
Yes, SPD focuses instead on minimizing the probability of a subcomponent being unmasked. It's a cleaner, less conflicting objective.
Okay, and the last one.
And finally, number 4, direct optimization of causal importance. This might be the most fundamental difference. Instead of relying on approximations of importance from those gradient-based attribution methods, which we know can be poor and unreliable, SPD directly optimizes a function whose job it is to represent causal importance.
So it's learning the importance directly, not guessing based on gradients.
Exactly. It leads to a much better, more faithful estimate of what truly matters to the model's output for any given input. It's asking the network itself to identify what's important rather than trying to infer it indirectly.
This really does sound like a significant leap forward, then, in mechanistic interpretability. If we connect this to the bigger picture now, what does SPD mean for the future? Especially when we think about tackling real-world, much larger models like today's massive language models.
Oh, it's potentially transformative. I mean, SPD, because it seems more scalable, more stable, it just opens up entirely new research possibilities. It removes these huge barriers, these roadblocks that previously hindered linear parameter decomposition methods from really tackling anything truly complex.
But it's not like a silver bullet yet, right? There must be mountains still to climb, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The paper is clear about that and outlines 2 main ones that come to mind immediately. First, just scaling to larger models.
It's a practical challenge.
Right. While SPD works on these more complex toy models, getting it to work reliably and efficiently on truly massive models, those with billions, maybe trillions of parameters, that's going to undoubtedly require further improvements in training stability, maybe new computational tricks.
Makes sense. And the second challenge?
The second one is clustering subcomponents. Remember, SPD finds these tiny rank 1 pieces. For the toy models, we knew the answer, the ground truth, so grouping them back into the full mechanisms was straightforward.
Right, you knew what you were looking for.
Exactly. But for a real-world model where you don't know the ground truth beforehand, we'll need sophisticated algorithmic clustering solutions. Clever ways to automatically figure out which little pieces belong together to form a meaningful, interpretable mechanism. That's a whole research area in itself.
Looking ahead then, beyond the challenges, one has to ask, what are some of the most exciting new research directions that SPD might unlock? What's on the horizon now that this seems possible?
Well, this leads me to wonder about a few things. Could we use SPD to really dig into how neural networks memorize information and what the precise relationship is between that memorization and their actual parameter storage capacity? That's a huge open question.
That would be fascinating.
It really would, and it could also pave the way for something quite radical. Training models that are intrinsically decomposed, models built to be interpretable from the ground up, designed with these components in mind, rather than having to reverse engineer them after the fact. Imagine building an AI you could literally read, like a book, understanding every conceptual step it takes because it was built that way.
That's a truly mind-bending thought. This deep dive into stochastic parameter decomposition, it really reveals that understanding the internal mechanisms of AI isn't just some, theoretical curiosity. It feels like a crucial practical step towards safer, more predictable, and ultimately far more powerful artificial intelligence. AI that we can actually trust because we understand how it works. Today, we've really seen how SPD moves us leaps and bounds closer to understanding the inner workings of neural networks, transforming them from these opaque black boxes into systems with increasingly transparent and, hopefully, understandable mechanisms.
It's a powerful reminder, I think, that even the most complex systems can potentially be understood if we find the right tools, the right ways to look, and if we dare to ask the right probing questions. The ability to decompose these networks into meaningful components, it really brings us closer to truly mastering AI, not just using it blindly.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Well, what SPD ultimately shows us is that the AI black box isn't necessarily destined to remain impenetrable forever. With the right tools, like SPD, we're not just predicting AI behavior anymore. We're just beginning, to read its mind. Think about what that means for every AI you interact with next. It's maybe no longer just magic. It's becoming knowable, understandable. What other black boxes in science or technology might be waiting for their own deep dive, their own SPD-like breakthrough? Thanks for diving deep with us. You've just taken a shortcut to being truly well-informed.